Alright, so in the last 60 years, the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has increased by nearly 100 in parts per million. And in the last century, our global sea level has risen 8 inches, and the surface temperature of our Earth has risen 2 degrees. According to NASA, these factors are all vital signs that our climate is rapidly changing. Changes in the environment can result in changes geographically, politically, socially, and economically. Therefore, nearly all people are affected by environmental developments in some way or another. Today, I'll be discussing the environmental movement, including the factors that shaped and altered it over time, the effects it has had on people, and where the movement stands today. To do this, I'll first examine the underlying groups that help fuel the movement, then the concept of environmental justice, and lastly, the movement's current position in the country where it originated. First, I'll focus on the foundation. So the environmental movement was fueled by several underlying groups that helped to fuel the overall movement. The Library of Congress stated in a multimedia collection called The Evolution of the Conservation Movement that it began with conservation in the late 1800s. It mostly focused on wildlife and fisheries as well as water and soil conservation. According to the National Park Service, when Theodore Roosevelt became president in 1901, he used his authority to protect wildlife and public lands by creating the United States Forest Service. With this service and his authority, he established over thousands of national parks and monuments across the United States. In the 1950s, the modern movement began, which turned the environmental movement into a social movement. Unlike the conservation movement, which has consisted of wealthy men, the modern movement also consisted of more common people. The biggest shift in power occurred in 1970 with the creation of the Clean Air Act, which, according to the EPA's laws and regulations, shifted the regulation of air emissions from a state to a federal level, as well as authorized the Environmental Protection Agency to establish the air standards that protect public health and welfare. 10 years later, the anti-nuclear movement began, which, according to Marco Giogni's book, Social Protest and Policy Change, focuses on the effects of the anti-nuclear movement, highlighting that it brought more public awareness to the environment. This resulted in the establishment of Green parties, formally organized political parties that are based on principles such as social justice and environmentalism. It seemed like the environmental movement was making progress until Ronald Reagan was inaugurated into office. One of the first things he wanted to do was deregulate the EPA because he questioned their legitimacy as an independent authority. While it's important to discuss the foundation of the movement, it's also important to look at who the movement affected mostly. While progress was made in most of North America and Europe, there are still several minorities struggling, living in brutal environmental conditions. It began with the Memphis sanitation strike in 1968. An excerpt from the Civil Rights Digital Library stated that over 700 African American workers joined together in a refusal to work, striking against years of poor pay and dangerous working conditions. The strike ended the same year with an agreement that included union recognition and wage increases, marking a turning point in black activism in Memphis. Things further progressed in 1982 with the Warren County PCB landfill incident, which the EPA's environmental justice timeline refers to as the catalyst for the environmental justice movement. The people in Warren County believe that the decision to place the landfill in their city was based off race and demographics rather than actual scientific evidence like soil fertility. In an editorial titled Dumping on the Poor, the Washington Post described the protest movement as the marriage of environmentalism with civil rights, showing how the movement was both environmentally and socially focused. The emerging movement resulted in more studies being done between demographics and hazardous landfills, and one conducted by the General Accounting Office was done on EPA Region 4, which is 8 states with a high proportion of minority residents. The conducted study showed that 4 hazardous landfills were located in the region's 8 states, with African Americans making up the majority of the population of the communities where they are located. In 1987, the United Church of Christ completed a study similar that also focused on the relationship between waste siting decisions and race in the United States. Their study found that 3 out of every 5 African Americans and Hispanics live in a community that is housing to toxic waste sites. While it seemed like the movement was making progress, it actually took a step backwards in the United States, where the movement originated. Now that I've discussed both the foundation and who was affected by it, I'm going to look at where the movement stands in the United States. Many believe that with the inauguration of President Donald Trump, we're taking a large step backwards when regarding environmental progress. This is largely due to the fact that on several occasions, Trump has stated, including on his verified Twitter account, Trump has stated that he would like to entirely abolish the EPA, the United States' largest environmental protection agency. Trump's view is not only irrational, but also dangerous, because without the EPA, we have no one regulating pollution levels and no one punishing companies who are doing so. On the other hand, Trump's newly appointed head of the EPA, Scott Pruitt, stated in an interview with Breitbart News that blaming climate change and environmental causes for the increased damage during Hurricane Harvey is a, quote, misplaced attempt. On the other hand, Michael E. Mann, a distinguished professor of atmospheric science at Penn State University, believes that climate change, quote, exacerbated several characteristics of the storm in a way that greatly increased the risk of damage and loss of life. While it is always important to focus on people that are suffering, it is extremely ignorant to ignore the fact that the condition of our poor environment aided in the damage of the storm. Pruitt also signed a repeal of the Clean Power Plan, which set regulations on emissions. According to the Union of Concerned Scientists, the plan also introduced new methods of reducing emissions, including investing in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and natural gas. Pruitt's proposal, however, does not offer any alternative or replacement plan at all for cutting emissions of carbon dioxide. Rather, he has said that they plan to seek public input on how to reduce them. In my opinion, it is much more efficient to trust environmental scientists over the uninformed public. Lastly, the activity of the EPA is significantly less in the first 6 months of Trump's presidency when comparing to the Obama, Clinton, and Bush administrations. Two roles of the EPA are to punish those who make violations and to regulate pollution levels among companies. The Environmental Integrity Project has released statistics that show that the Trump administration's EPA has collected 60% less in civil penalties than previous administrators had collected in environmental violations. They also conducted that there is a significant drop in the number of environmental lawsuits filed against companies for breaking pollution control laws. However, in a sense, I believe that the ignorance of our new authority actually binds common people together in their beliefs. So today I discussed the foundation of the environmental movement and how environmental awareness came to be as popular as it is today. I then reviewed the concept of environmental justice and its effect on minorities and the movement itself. And lastly, I examined the current condition of the movement where it originated in the United States. Luckily for us, the environment change is dramatically slow, and it is unlikely that any of us will have to bear the brutal conditions that result from human activity, and then the occasional heat wave. So the next time Ms. Ferris lets us out of class early because it's too hot, thank the environment.